We see a global trend saying that the benefits from sustainable investment can be in the order of 26 trillion by 2030. And the World Investment Report said that sustainability, even with COVID, grew by 80% in global capital markets from 2019. Yet, when we look at the Global Recovery Observatory, which we're developing with Oxford, it shows only 18% of recovery spending can be really classified as green, or let's say more sustainably oriented. So, of course, there are big challenges in this space.
We see a lot of change happening in private markets, a lot of awareness of sustainability. People are starting to realize that there isn't necessarily a trade-off, but it's still far too easy to make a good profit doing unsustainable things. And that has to change. We have the markets themselves, the financial regulation and supervision, the allocation decisions of investors, they have to shift so that unsustainable investments are no longer profitable, and certainly nowhere near as profitable as the sustainable ones. But for that to happen, we need a shift in mindset.
The name of the game is alignment, and that's where Elliot's point is very valid. We're looking for systemic alignment. We're looking for systemic changes and not transaction by transaction anymore. And to systemically change, you need to bring the SDGs to the financial sector. So our approach that help us, our country offices, kind of, if you want, use this wheel that you're seeing in front of you with the SDGs in the middle. And the right side of the wheel, the light blue, is all of our work around public finance. And the left side of the wheel, the dark blue, is all of our work on private finance and private capital. The secret sauce is going across this wheel, right? As Sheila mentioned, the public and the private coming together either through instruments or through policy or a combination of everything in that aspect. Now, let me get to the famous INFFs, which I'm delighted to see that has been fully endorsed, right, by the G20 Declaration of Rome last week. We actually have a whole paragraph that endorses a voluntary framework for the G20 to support the implementation of INFFs around the world. And I think that is a huge, huge gain. And what we're trying to do with INFFs is basically to close a gap between planning and finance, right? So you got a plan as a government. Have you thought about how much that plan costs? Have you thought about what percentage of that cost will come from public finance, what percent will come from private capital? How you are going to attract the private capital, how you are going to reform your budget. So that is really this vertical integration, but it also helps us to integrate public and private finance policies, as well as integrate across government partners. So a vertical as well as two horizontal integrations.
Our strategy for the next 3 years is to work on institutional change, so helping the financial institutions to integrate sustainability into their strategies. And as Elliot was saying, it's really become about alignment, aligning the financial institutions and their portfolios with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. And so that's what we're working on there. And also focusing increasingly on system change. So working more with policymakers and regulators on what's needed to create the enabling environment for the financial institutions to drive that transition in the real economy. The way we do this is really under these 3 industry frameworks. So the first one you see there, the Principles for Responsible Banking, really has grown since they were launched in 2019. Now it's over 40% of the global banking sector. This is, of course, critical in emerging markets, developing countries where banks are much more fundamentally responsible for the financing of the private sector than capital markets. And so that's helping to transform the banking industry worldwide. The Principles for Sustainable Insurance since 2012, working with insurers, initially focusing on integrating environmental, social, and governance issues into the underwriting process, obviously also key for the real economy. And this is also linked to the approach, which is more risk-based, of the Principles for Responsible Investment, where I think over 4,000 institutional investors now worldwide have signed up to integrate environmental, social governance into their decision-making. And so building on that, we've also launched in the last few years the Net Zero Alliances. So you may have heard of some of these, even if you didn't know we were behind them. The Net Zero Banking Alliance, I think, is quite interesting because even though it was only launched in April, there are already 89 banks signed up with 66 trillion in assets. And that includes some of the biggest fossil fuel financiers in the world.
To help promote sustainable finance in Thailand, the UN in Thailand co-organized the high-level roundtable with the Government Pension Fund and the Ministry of Finance in September. This roundtable entitled Sustainable Thailand, Sustainable Investing, Sustainable Banking, aimed to unite institutional investors and banks to note the UN principle of responsible investment in banking as the framework of operations. It will also bring awareness and action on climate change and SDG among financial institutions in Thailand. 410 attendees participated in this event, and 43 financial institutions, including asset management companies and banks, with total asset size $1.3 trillion, signed a statement of commitment to invest and operate business aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. As the next steps, UNEP FI plans to co-host information session with its stakeholders on the UN Sustainable Finance Principle to promote its uptake. We need to communicate, for example, on what commitments they entail and how they may be helpful for Thai financial institutions. Currently, the UN in Thailand is exploring how the integrated national financing framework can be connected to the central bank efforts in developing the Thai clean taxonomy, as well as how to align the work on an integrated national financing framework with the principle for responsible banking. This is a joint work that PAGE can offer to help promote sustainable finance in Thailand.
We are working on issues like issuance of bonds, standards. We are supporting Cambodia at the moment. We are also doing some work on debt for climate swaps. We have an interesting project with the PIF, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. They are interested in a feasibility study, and we are supporting that. And in March, we are going to organize together with them, with PIF, a conference on debt in the Pacific.
And I think what is clear, what you also presented, is the importance of the UNCT to come together and work together, and also use the fantastic capacities and knowledge that are embedded in the economic commissions, as well as in many other agencies as well, of course.
So I see a lot of interesting threads forward, Elliot and Sheila and colleagues. I think we need to be driven by the country perspective. This needs to be demand driven. They're dealing with very, very scarce resources, very, very scarce limited fiscal space, especially in view of the debt burden that you've spoken to, Marcos, and Elliot, that you've spoke to earlier as well. I think we have some very interesting ingredients with PAGE, with the work of the INFF. Marcos, it's fascinating to hear what you have going. And I think along with what UNEP FI has going in the private finance space, we have an excellent array of partnerships and tools. Let's think about how we deliver better at the country level. That would be my primary thought.
We are not yet where we need to be in terms of policy alignment. Our budgets are not SDG compliant. Our overall policy frameworks are not. I would suggest, and this is what I think I want everybody to take away from this, we as UN country teams, as resident coordinators, as country economists, that we should be pushing first and foremost. We're not going to have any kind of reasonable national sustainable development strategy unless we align policies with the sustainable development goals. But in doing so, we've already taken a major step forward towards transforming our economies. And in doing so, with that alignment, we're setting the stage for encouraging the private sector and the private financial sector above all to do the same thing. And that we can start doing already yesterday, because that's what the UN is about. It's about the Sustainable Development Agenda. We may not be financial experts, each and every one of us in our own individual capacities, but we do know which side of the bread is buttered, and we do know what needs to change in terms of policy. Let us get out there, and in every discussion we have with our interlocutors on the ground, let us make sure to stress that point, please, because without that, none of the rest of this is going to work.